Penguin Random House Audio presents Marrow by Samantha Shea. Read for you by Saskia Maarleveld. Wanting is a powerful magic. Sophie McIntosh. Blue Ticket. Chapter 1. For years, Oona had dreamt of her return to Marrow. At night, lying in bed beside Jacob, she used to fantasize about the sour brine of the marsh air, pretend she could still feel the grit of salt on her skin. It would bring her a kind of peace, she'd thought, to see the island materialize on the horizon, to catch sight of its foggy shores and rocky coast. But of course, in her dreams, Oona had always imagined herself up on deck, stationed at the bow like a figurehead. In reality, though, she spent most of her first ferry ride in over a decade down in the bowels of the boat, squatting on the slick floor of the head, vomiting up her breakfast. As yet another wave crashed into the side of the hull, and the ferry lurched sideways, Oona tried blaming her nausea on the years she'd spent on shore. She blamed the storm that had rolled in earlier that afternoon, the reason they were all running late. But deep down, she knew it wasn't as simple as any of that. She'd thought it would have passed by now. But the truth was she'd been sick back in Portland, too. It had been a struggle, trying to conceal it from Jacob. She couldn't tell him yet, though. It was too soon. Something could still go wrong. Something always went wrong. Below decks, Oona braced herself once again as the captain threw the engines into reverse. But thankfully no great pitch forward followed. Instead, she heard the grinding whir of the propellers as they began churning in the water. And she realized they were docking. They'd made it. She was home. Marrow Island was large compared to some of its neighbors. Rocky outcroppings reachable only by dinghy or rowboat. But compared to towns on the mainland, compared to Portland, it was nothing. Just 20 square miles of marshland, caves, and tide pools. A tiny town that had grown up around the port where the ferries docked. As a girl, Oona had lived in awe of that small town. She loved its hustle and bustle, the shops that lined the cobbled Main Street, the dive that sold lobster rolls and French fries in the summer. She'd even loved the hawking cries of the fishermen at dusk, the way the gulls would circle overhead as customers stooped to examine the daily catches displayed in rows of coolers on the docks. Still, she was surprised to find the town largely unchanged. It was April, off-season, so the town's only restaurant hadn't opened yet, but everything else was just as she remembered it. As she made her way down the ferry's gangplank, she could see the grocery store off to her left. Its faded green canopy still said Albert's, though she'd read in the papers that Al himself had died a few years back. Next to the grocery was the Roberts' pharmacy, and then after the pharmacy was the hardware store owned by the Clarks. Looking at those shops, all in a row, Oona couldn't help but remember the last time she'd seen their owners, the way those 3 men had stood to block her entrance to the funeral. They were only doing what the Tanakas had asked them to do, only trying to support their grieving friends and neighbors. But that didn't mean Oona couldn't hold a grudge. Good riddance, she thought as she turned away from Al's. At the end of the dock, she put down her bag to rest. Her luggage wasn't heavy, but she was out of breath. That last hour in the ship's bathroom had taken a lot out of her. She leaned against the dock's railing and stared down at her duffel. She didn't even know what she'd packed. An old pair of sneakers, her navy raincoat. Her trip, it hadn't exactly been well planned. She'd panicked. That's what Jacob would say if she was to call him, tell him what she'd done. She'd started feeling desperate, so she'd allowed herself to be lured in, once again, by the fairy tale promise of a simple solution. If she let him, she knew he would convince her to return to the mainland. "Mrs. Jones?" A young woman approached Oona tentatively, and though she wasn't wearing anything all that telling, wasn't, for instance, dressed in a purple robe, still, Oona's first thought was that the girl looked like an initiate. Only to be an initiate, she would have to be pregnant, and as far as Oona could tell, she was not. "Are you Mrs. Jones?" It took a minute before Oona remembered the name she'd assumed when she'd called the center from Portland and found there was actually one guest not yet accounted for. Her arrival time for that very weekend still unconfirmed. It was a minor miracle. Though the center technically remained open all year long, the midwife spent the off-season caring for local women. The only time they accepted outsiders was during the summer session, which ran roughly from just before Beltane to Lunasa, or from late April to August 1st. Oona hadn't actually expected to be able to attend. She'd called out of sheer desperation. But when she'd discovered there was an opening, she'd made the split-second decision to claim it as her own. "That's me," Oona said on the dock. "I'm Maggie Jones." The girl breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank goodness. For a second I thought I was going to have to tell them that I'd lost you." She laughed, but Oona offered only a small smile in return. "I'm Holly," the girl said. She reminded Oona of a Girl Scout, all bright helpfulness and good cheer. "I'm an initiate here this season." She stuck out one hand, and this time Oona smiled more genuinely. So she'd been right, she thought. The girl was an initiate. That was good news. It meant that she was new to the island. "Here," said Holly. "Let me get that bag for you. We've got a jeep waiting just over there. You see it?" She pointed, and Oona nodded. The jeep, though, that was also new. It even had the center's name stenciled on the side. Bare Root Fertility Center. Fancy. When Oona was little, the only car the center had owned was a truck. Red, with rusted wheel wells, it broke down at least once a month. That's how Oona got to spend so much time running wild on the docks in town, watching the fishermen. Otherwise, for many years, she'd rarely left the center's grounds. "You were late getting in," Holly said as Oona followed her to the jeep. "We were expecting you all closer to 2. I was just telling the other ladies here that I'm afraid you've likely missed supper." When Holly opened the car's back door, Oona realized there were already 2 other women waiting. A wealthy-looking Asian woman who was perched on the bench seat farthest from Oona, her wrists adorned with gold, and a tall black woman who was holding a small spiral notebook. Once Oona finally got herself up and into the car, the woman with the notebook chuckled. "This thing needs a set of stairs or something," she offered. Oona smiled politely, but didn't respond. She'd never been very good at small talk, and anyway, she figured she wasn't there to make friends. Friends were just a liability for someone like her, someone who needed to go unnoticed. It was bad enough that she'd shown up looking like such a mess. The 2 women to her left were dressed quite differently from each other. The woman seated by the window was wearing a pair of fur-lined duck boots and what looked like an expensive winter coat, while the woman with the notebook was dressed more simply, but they both looked put together, tidy and well-groomed. Oona, on the other hand, was greasy and bloated. When she glanced down, she saw there were flecks of vomit on her coat. She hadn't bothered to look up how much a visit to the center would cost, because any amount would have been too much for her. But now she worried that her ratty duffel, her thrift store jacket, would give her away. "Ready, gals?" Holly called from the front seat as the jeep's engine turned over. The other 2 women chirped back, "Ready," but Oona just slouched against her door, pressed her forehead to the window's glass. It was after 6, and already the sun was dropping low in the sky, dusk drifting in like a rolling fog. As the car pulled onto the main road, the other 2 women closed their eyes, probably grateful for the respite after the long ferry ride. But Oona found she couldn't look away. She needed to see the salt-stung, shingled buildings of Port Marrow give way to the sharp rise of the forest's towering pines, to stare out at the breathtaking expanse of rocky tide pools that stretched along the shore for miles. She told herself that she wasn't scared. She just needed the reminder that it was all real, that she was finally home. But when she glanced down, she saw she was gripping her seatbelt so tightly, every one of her knuckles had flushed white. Still, despite her anxiety, Oona soon found herself lulled by the journey, drowsy by the time they pulled into the center's long clamshell drive. As soon as the car came to a stop, though, the fear was back in her chest, thrashing like a caged bird. She jiggled the handle on the door twice before Holly told her to wait a minute. She would come around to let them out. Trapped, Oona thought, briefly panicked. But then the door swung open, and she tumbled out onto the drive. The woman with the notebook followed, but when the other woman moved to join them, Holly told her it wasn't yet her turn. She was going to be staying in a cabin on the other side of the compound, in House Imbolc. Oona and Shelley, for that was the name of the woman with the notebook, Shelley, were marked down for House Samhain. Oona had nearly forgotten that the cabins were each named after one of the 8 sabbats. "Here are your keys," Holly said, as she handed first Oona.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?